Picture this: the North Atlantic in 1942. A convoy of merchant ships plows through waters so thick with fog that you cannot see beyond the bow of your own vessel. The air tastes of salt and diesel, and somewhere beneath those churning waves, death is circling. German U-boats prowl these shipping lanes like wolves, and in conditions like these, they are nearly invincible. The fog that blinds Allied sailors is the U-boat commander's greatest ally, transforming the ocean into a hunting ground where the hunter cannot be seen and the prey cannot hide. For the men tasked with protecting these convoys, the challenge was nothing short of insurmountable. Radar, that technological marvel that had given the Allies an edge in so many theaters of war, struggled against the atmospheric chaos of the Atlantic. Heavy weather, dense fog, and the simple fact that submarines spent most of their time submerged rendered radar nearly useless in the very conditions where convoy protection mattered most. Visual spotting was a joke when visibility measured in feet rather than miles. The lookouts on destroyer bridges strained their eyes into walls of gray mist, knowing that somewhere in that void, periscopes rose and torpedo tubes swung into firing position. This was the desperate reality facing the Allied navies as they hemorrhaged ships and sailors to Admiral Dönitz's U-boat fleet. Conventional wisdom said that finding a submerged submarine in poor visibility was impossible. You might as well try to locate a single fish in the entire ocean. The mathematics of the problem were brutal. Millions of cubic meters of water, one small submarine designed specifically to be undetectable, and weather conditions that stripped away every technological advantage the surface fleet possessed. Something radical was needed. Something that seemed, at first hearing, absolutely insane. The answer, improbable as it seemed, lay not in seeing, but in listening. While engineers on both sides of the Atlantic raced to perfect radar and other electronic detection systems, a smaller group of scientists pursued a different path entirely. They turned to the ocean itself, to the way sound moves through water, and in doing so, they opened a new front in the technological arms race that would ultimately help win the Battle of the Atlantic. The principles were understood, but the application was revolutionary. Sound travels through water approximately 4 times faster than through air, and it travels much farther before dissipating. Every submarine, no matter how carefully designed, makes noise. Engines hum, propellers cavitate, hull plates expand and contract. Electric motors whine at frequencies the human ear can barely perceive. The challenge was not whether U-boats made sound. They absolutely did, but whether that sound could be detected, interpreted, and used to guide a killing blow before the submarine slipped away into the depths. Enter Asdic, the British name for what Americans called sonar. The acronym allegedly stood for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, though historians have debated whether such a committee ever actually existed or if the name was deliberate misdirection. Regardless of its origins, Asdic represented a fundamental shift in anti-submarine warfare. The system consisted of a large, flat transmitter housed in a dome mounted on the keel of escort vessels, positioned directly beneath the bridge. High-speed motors generated powerful sound pulses that could be directed in sweeping arcs through the water, reaching out 3,000 to 4,000 yards under ideal conditions. The early equipment was crude, and Naval Command was skeptical. How could pinging sounds possibly compete with proven visual detection methods? But the acousticians understood what the admirals did not. In the fog, in the storm, in the darkness of the Atlantic night, sound was the only sense that mattered. Hydrophones, essentially underwater microphones, could pick up the distinctive acoustic signatures of diesel engines, electric motors, and propeller noise that marked a U-boat's passage through the deep. Each class of U-boat had its own acoustic fingerprint, subtle variations in frequency and rhythm that a trained ear could identify as surely as a fingerprint expert identifies a suspect. What transformed Asdic from a promising theory into a weapon that changed the course of the war was not the technology itself, but the men who operated it. They called themselves submarine detectors, abbreviated as SD, though others knew them as ping merchants for the distinctive sound their equipment made. These men underwent training that can only be described as brutally comprehensive, designed to push human auditory perception to its absolute limits. The training began with theory. The physics of sound propagation through water. The effects of temperature layers and salinity on acoustic transmission. The characteristics of different frequencies and the specific sounds made by various types of vessels. But theory was only the beginning. The real education happened at facilities like the Canadian Asdic School in Halifax, where recruits faced the attack table, a sophisticated simulator staffed by veteran anti-submarine warfare experts whose job was to break the trainees before the ocean did. Commander Welland, the Royal Canadian Navy's top anti-submarine expert, orchestrated these sessions with almost sadistic precision. He created impossible scenarios, multiple U-boats attacking through thermal layers that bent sound waves unpredictably, weather conditions that filled the water with false echoes, mechanical failures at critical moments. He screamed and berated the recruits when they made mistakes, driving some to tears, pushing all of them to the breaking point. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but preparation for the chaos of actual combat, where a moment's hesitation or a misidentified echo could mean the difference between survival and a watery grave for hundreds of men. The psychological demands were immense. Submarine detectors learned to filter out the cacophony of the ocean, the groan of their own ship's hull, the thrash of propellers, the biological noise of marine life, the rumble of distant storms, and focus with laser intensity on the subtle audio anomalies that might indicate a U-boat. They developed an almost superhuman ability to discern minute shifts in pitch that revealed a submarine changing depth or speed. They could identify specific U-boat types by the unique harmonics of their machinery, distinguishing a Type 7 from a Type 9 by nothing more than the whisper of sound that reached their headphones. After weeks in the classroom and on the attack table came the final test. Live exercises in St. Margaret's Bay near Halifax, where Allied submarines simulated U-boat tactics. For 10 days and nights, the trainees hunted a Dutch submarine that wheeled and dodged in the depths, shut down its engines to sit silently on the bottom, and employed every evasive technique a real U-boat commander might use. Contact was established, then lost. Attacks were launched, critiqued, and launched again. The submarine detectors learned that their equipment had limitations. Asdic could not maintain contact during the final moments of a depth charge attack, creating a critical blind window when the U-boat might escape, and they learned how to compensate through experience and intuition. When a fully trained submarine detector took his station aboard an escort vessel, he became the ship's most critical weapon. His watch schedule was punishing. 2 hours on the Asdic set, 2 hours on lookout duty, then back to the set, cycling endlessly as the convoy plowed through the Atlantic. The work was monotonous to the point of madness. The constant pinging of the Asdic haunted their sleep, invaded their dreams. After several weeks at sea, SD ratings were completely drained, yet they could never truly rest because they knew the lives of their shipmates and the merchant sailors in the convoy depended entirely on their ability to detect a stalking submarine before torpedoes were in the water. When contact was made, that distinctive echo bouncing back from something solid in the depths, everything changed in an instant. The submarine detector's training took over. He had to maintain contact while the escort vessel maneuvered into attack position. feeding constant updates on the target's bearing, range, and depth. Other ships in the escort screen would be vectored in to establish additional contact points, creating a triangulation that pinned the U-boat's position with increasing accuracy. The actual attack was a carefully choreographed dance between the acoustician and the depth charge crews. Patterns of charges, each containing 150 pounds of high explosive, were prepared based on the submarine's estimated depth and course. The SD had to maintain contact as long as possible, compensating for the Doppler shift as the range closed, adjusting for the target's evasive maneuvers. Then came the critical moment when Asdic went blind, when the escort vessel passed directly over the target and the geometry made acoustic contact impossible. At that instant, the charges were released, set to detonate at varying depths, creating a pattern of overlapping blast zones designed to crush the U-boat's pressure hull, or at minimum, damage it severely enough to force it to surface. The results spoke for themselves. In the first 6 months of the war, the effectiveness of depth charge attacks hovered around a dismal 1 to 3%. But as Asdic systems improved and operators gained experience, those numbers climbed dramatically. By early 1944, Allied forces were sinking more U-boats than the U-boats were sinking ships, a reversal that represented the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. By D-Day, the acoustic screen maintained by Allied escorts was so effective that not a single ship was lost to U-boats during the critical Normandy invasion, even though German submarines desperately tried to interdict the largest amphibious operation in history. The fog that had once been the U-boat's greatest advantage became irrelevant. Darkness meant nothing. Storm conditions that would have allowed a submarine to approach undetected in earlier years now offered no protection against the all-hearing electronic ears of the Asdic operators. The hunters had become the hunted, and the weapon that accomplished this reversal was sound itself, wielded by men whose auditory perception had been honed to an almost superhuman degree. When the war ended and the final U-boats surrendered or were scuttled, the technology and techniques developed by those pioneering acousticians did not fade into obscurity. Instead, they formed the foundation for every advancement in underwater acoustic detection that followed. The principles of passive hydrophone arrays, the understanding of how thermal layers and ocean conditions affect sound propagation, the recognition that different vessels have unique acoustic signatures. All of these insights, purchased with the lives of merchant sailors and paid for by the exhausting vigilance of submarine detectors, became the bedrock of Cold War anti-submarine warfare. The Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, which tracked Soviet submarines throughout the Cold War using vast networks of seabed hydrophones, was a direct descendant of WWII acoustic research. Modern towed array sonar systems, capable of detecting submarines at ranges that would have seemed like science fiction to a 1943 destroyer captain, evolved from the same basic principles that guided those early Asdic operators as they hunted U-boats in the fog-shrouded Atlantic. Even today's sophisticated signal processing algorithms, running on computers millions of times more powerful than anything available during the war, are performing fundamentally the same task: separating the meaningful acoustic signal from the noise of the ocean, identifying the specific signature that marks a submarine's presence. But beyond the technology, there is a broader lesson in the story of the acoustic warriors who fought the Battle of the Atlantic. They proved that human ingenuity, when pressed by necessity, can overcome obstacles that seem utterly impossible. They demonstrated that the solution to a problem sometimes lies not in doing what everyone expects, but in approaching the challenge from an entirely different angle. The conventional wisdom said that finding submarines in poor visibility was impossible. The acoustician said, "Then we will not look for them. We will listen." They transformed a human limitation into an advantage. They took sailors whose eyes were useless in the Atlantic fog and gave them ears that could hear through miles of water. They created a weapon from a sense that naval warfare had largely ignored, and in doing so, they helped win the longest continuous battle of World War II. The U-boats that prowled the convoy routes, sinking tankers and freighters with impunity in the early war years, found themselves increasingly on the defensive, hunted by an enemy they could not see and could barely comprehend. The pinging that echoed through their hulls became a harbinger of doom, announcing that the invisible had become visible, that the silent predator had been heard. The men who accomplished this extraordinary feat, the submarine detectors who spent endless watches with headphones clamped to their ears, straining to hear the whisper of a diesel engine or the cavitation of a propeller through the roar of the ocean, never received the recognition afforded to fighter pilots or commando units. Theirs was a lonely, exhausting, psychologically demanding war fought in cramped compartments aboard ships that pitched and rolled in the North Atlantic swell. But their contribution to Allied victory was incalculable. They proved that the impossible was merely difficult, and that human beings, when properly trained and motivated, could develop sensory capabilities that bordered on the superhuman. So the next time you consider what seems impossible, remember the acoustic warriors of the Atlantic. Remember that somewhere in the history of human endeavor, someone looked at an insurmountable problem and found a way forward not by doing what everyone else attempted, but by listening when everyone else was trying to see. That is the true legacy of the men who hunted U-boats with sound. Not just the technology they pioneered, but the enduring reminder that impossible is often just another word for a problem that requires a different kind of thinking.